Welcome to this global progress meeting. It is a real pleasure and honor for me and for us to have such a high-level group of leaders, now they will come, and thinkers from the progressive world here today. With the purpose of moving forward on the global progressive agenda, this new phase of the Global Progress Program will deal with two new elements. First, the beginning of an intergenerational dialogue between former and future progressive leaders in the world, with the creation of the Global Progress Council of consolidated leaders and the Future Leaders Initiative. And second, the creation of high-level working groups that these groups have or will focus on three main challenges: the development and promotion of the new economics for prosperity in the aftermath of the economic and financial crisis, the ongoing social and demographic changes both in the US and Europe, which will shape the way progressive movements connect with the electorate in the future, and the new realities emerging from increasing migration flows worldwide, which are giving way to xenophobia and racism across many of our countries. Let me talk briefly about these challenges then. We are all going through a deep crisis. People usually say that it's an economic crisis. For me, things are not so simple. In fact, we are enduring three simultaneous crises: economic crisis, a climate crisis, and a food and poverty crisis. But first and foremost, this is a crisis of values. The facts that lie behind it are not wrong technical decisions or unintended mistakes. They are the direct results of an ideological offensive, the promotion of aggressive individualism, the belief that greed is good. Conservatives have told us in the past that human beings behaved as Homo economicus, and as such were expected to develop in a society that contained a few drops of inequality. With the right incentive, some citizens would manage to get richer, and their wealth would eventually trickle down to the rest. Then, and for this reason, it was necessary to minimize the role of government and to get rid of regulation. We have suffered the dreadful consequences of such thinking. They were wrong in terms of values, in ethic terms, but also in economic terms. As managers, they have been a disaster. However, there is another factor we should take into account: the role of inequality. If we analyze the social background of the crisis, we will notice a hefty dose of inequality. In 2007, for example, in the US, the share of total income of the top 1% of earners was 23%. Surprisingly, this share of wealth was exactly the same in 1928, on the verge of the other big crisis, when 1% of the population accumulated 24% of the income. We know how these stories ended. In both cases, the high level of inequality was not only costly in terms of values, but it brought about disastrous effects that can be understood and even measured in economic terms. These unequal societies, which had become more and more polarized between the wealthy and the poor, were unable to absorb the burst of the financial bubble, and they fell into crisis. There is today scientific evidence to explain the dangers of polarization and the importance of fostering egalitarian measures. Two British epidemiologists, Wilkinson and Pickett, give plenty of examples to confirm that high equality levels in a state go hand in hand with better life standards. They say that in more egalitarian societies, citizens enjoy better health, longer life expectancy, less infant mortality, less violence. They have more innovation capacity and more economic development prospects. In all possible spheres, the more equal states have scored better than those that are less equal. I think that it is our duty as progressives to speak out and explain the clear benefits of equality. At the end of the day, if we are convinced that the origin of the crisis was ideological, we need to plan a better strategy and frame a more powerful discourse in the near future. We must spell it out clearly. Equality is not only a value, it's an economic tool, and we must use it. Now, regarding the future, our hopes are inevitably linked to a new productive model based on economic, environmental, and social sustainability. To achieve this model, we need a high level of specialization and innovation, which will require better training, more gender equality, and due to the demographics, squeeze a sufficiently large active population. Moreover, we will have to implement equality policies that guarantee access to education for all and that ensure work-life balance for both women and men. Equality policies, therefore, will be essential in order to develop an efficient economic model. However, the other side of equality is diversity, and it should also come into play. We progressives must be assertive in the defense of diversity as the only way to progress. There is no society, in the past, in the present, or in the future, that has progressed in isolation. Civilization has thriven in diversity, and today, in a globalized world, diversity is not an unavoidable phenomenon, but a very positive one. We need to look out for skills. The Forum of Economic Development has pointed out that the developed West has had to resort to external labor pools. The US, for example, will need to employ 20 million qualified migrants in 20 years. Time, because they don't have enough at home, and this is also true in Europe. How will we manage? We must stop restricting or preventing diversity. Instead, we will have to start managing it well. This must be our discourse. We progressives know how to manage diversity better, not only because of our policies of integration, but because when we are in office, our discourse of tolerance facilitates the integration of newcomers by strengthening the social nets. We don't focus on the differences. On the contrary, we strive to bind people together. Well, to finish, let's focus on the reforms that will lead us to the new economic model, taking into account the need for a great degree of cohesion for the sake of fairness and efficiency. In order to achieve this, in the current context, budget restriction, weak economic growth, we must focus on those instruments that ensure equal opportunities to citizens through more active social policies, conceived as an economic reactivation instrument, rather than just a protective measure. We must invest more in education, scholarship, nursery schools for the 0 to 3 range, that is, in issues contributing to work-life balance. With more social protection, we will have a better society in economic terms. We must fight for it and demonstrate why it is good. Better social capital means more resources to resist adversity, lower crime rates, less inequality-related violence. Investing in social capital improves individual rights and provides a better setting for economic activity. Social rights are not only part of a mechanism of protection, but they can be turned into a dynamic force for economic recovery. Only when we manage to convey to the public opinion that a transforming project with a social component is possible, we will be able to get our agenda for change off the ground. I know for sure that John shares my concern and special interest in the areas such as immigration and social rights. As you all know, John Podesta is a great specialist in constitutional issues. He has played a major role in US politics as Chief of Staff of President Clinton and as co-chair of President Obama's transition team. And as head of Center for American Progress, he has turned the institution into a leading organization in the development and advocacy of progressive policies and politics both in the USA and internationally. Let us receive him with a warm applause.
Thank you, Jesus. And I would only amend your comments in one regard, which is that the students who I teach at Georgetown Law School would probably disagree about my being a constitutional expert. But beyond that, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. This is a great partnership that we have in building global progress with Jesus and the Fundación Ideas. We've had many meetings in the past, but the caliber of participants here gathered in this room and the people I'm about to call on the stage really, I think, is taking this to a new level. And it indicates that we have a lot of work to do, but we have a lot of thought leaders who we've brought together. It's my pleasure to introduce a distinguished and really wonderful panel. What we've tried to do is blend some of the people who have been the most successful leaders of progressive governance over the past really couple of decades, and combine them for our first panel to kick this off with some new and rising stars in the progressive movements, so that we can get an interaction between people who have been there and done it and people who are challenged to be able to make the progressive project come to life in their own countries. So let me introduce our panelists. After I've got them all on stage, we're going to have a brief moment where we take a photo together. I'll invite Jesus back up, and then former Prime Minister Felipe González will have a word of welcome, and we'll get going. But first, let me introduce Matthias Machnig, the Minister of Economy and Labor and Technology in Thüringen, Germany. He's one of the leading strategists for the Social Democratic Party. He was the architect of the two successful campaigns for Chancellor for Gerhard Schröder. Next, Helle Thorning-Schmidt, the leader of the Danish Social Democratic Party, a member of the Danish Parliament since 2005. Next, Carme Chacón, the Spanish Minister of Defense. She's a leading figure amongst the new generation of Spanish progressives. And then let me introduce a group of really distinguished leaders who, between them, I think, have led successful progressive governments for more than 30 years combined. First, Felipe González, the former Prime Minister of Spain and the President of the Global Progress Council. Next, Tony Blair, the former UK Prime Minister. And finally, my former boss, and sometimes I feel like my current boss, President William Jefferson Clinton. Please join me in giving them all a hand. As I noted, we'll take our seats, but former Prime Minister Felipe González, who you'll hear more at dinner from, will just provide us with brief welcoming remarks. Go ahead.
Gracias, John. A modo de saludo, introduciré los tres desafíos que creo que deberían orientar nuestra reflexión para enfrentar el futuro.
Welcome. I'm going to submit the three challenges I think we have to face for the future.
Hay que enfrentar una crisis de gobernanza global en materia económica, en materia política y de seguridad.
A global governance crisis first in politics, economics, and security.
Y también hay que reconocer una crisis de gobernanza de la democracia representativa.
And also we have to recognize there's a crisis of the representative democracy governance.
Si queremos llegar a un pensamiento progresista que nos una, tenemos que tener el mismo diagnóstico de la crisis financiera, de sus repercusiones y de la respuesta que tenemos que dar.
If we want to have a united progressive program, we have to have a united diagnosis of the financial crisis and the...
Y en tercer lugar, tenemos que reflexionar y avanzar sobre qué modelo económico es el que nos va a unir, el que consideramos mejor.
And we also have to see which economic model that is going to unite us we think is best.
Queremos una economía altamente competitiva.
We want a very competitive economy
que genere empleo,
that can generate employment,
con el excedente suficiente para mantener un nivel alto de cohesión social
with a sufficient surplus to maintain a high level of social cohesion,
y que sea sostenible medioambientalmente.
and also with a sustainable environment.
Eso puede ser una carta a los Reyes Magos
This can be a letter for the three kings
si no la contraponemos a algo que está ocurriendo.
if we don't oppose it to something that is taking place.
Una economía financiera,
A financial economy
globalizada,
that is globalized,
sin reglas
without any rules,
y que volverá a crear otra burbuja financiera en los próximos 5, 6, 7 años con una nueva crisis
and
financiera y
which
económica.
is going to lead to a new financial bubble in a few years with a new.
I think that's a terrible mistake. It's worth it for 2 years to get the unemployment compensation in, to get the payroll tax relief, and to just give the economy time to heal and recover. Then I believe that we ought to be in the United States and everywhere else in the business of changing this from is this government or anti-government to what's good for the future as against what's holding on to the present, against how do we build a future of shared prosperity and shared responsibilities as opposed to continuing to grow more unequal. In the experiment that they launched in 1981, we have become the most unequal big country in the world by light years. In 1980, 90% of the American people had 65% of the income, and they had done since the end of World War II. That enabled us to build a great middle class. The top 1% of us had 9% of the income. Today, those figures are 52% and 22%. And they were only interrupted, I'm glad to say, when in my second term, when we produced 4 budget surpluses, the bottom 20%'s income in percentage terms increased as much as the top 20%. We have something to say, but we have to be simple, we have to direct, and we have to look like we have our priorities in order, and we have to remember the ultimate lesson of Tony Blair's successes and what we tried to do. We can never defend the indefensible. We can never look like we are in defense of anything that is just because it is. So that if we defend something, it has to be because it's creating a better future and it will make us a country of shared prosperity and shared responsibilities. That's my basic take on it. We have to reformulate this. I tried and tried and tried for 8 years to break this binary debate, and I didn't succeed, obviously, because we had 8 more years of it. So that's how I see it.
Let me turn to Tony Blair. And Tony, you had a great success in trying to build a government that produced both strong growth, was extremely practical, got results, but made important investments in the people in the UK. Now we're in a period in which the pendulum has swung back, both in the election and also in sort of the governing philosophy of the incoming Conservative Party. And you see the withdrawing of those investments. And I guess I would just ask you to, how do you think that the Labour Party and progressives ought to react to that period of retrenchment that Prime Minister Cameron is undertaking?
Well, I mean, I think, let me speak from the point of view of the UK and maybe same challenges in Europe too. I mean, the first thing is we have to, I think, be very frank with ourselves about what the nature of the challenge is. We've lost far too many elections in Europe over this last period, and we lost the election in the UK. And I always remember after we lost 4 elections in a row in the UK, and the final defeat was in 1992, and that was the 4th election in a row. And I remember meeting a party activist who said to me, "The people have voted against us now 4 times in a row. What's wrong with them?" And I think we face basically 3 challenges in my view: an economic model challenge, a social model challenge, and a cultural issue. And I don't think the position is very different in the UK from the rest of Europe. And on the deficit and so on, it's really very simple. I mean, as a result of the financial crisis, all countries are having to work out a deficit reduction plan. It's inevitable. The thing that puzzles people in the progressive politics is why hasn't the financial crisis in Europe produced a wave of left-wing governments? I'm afraid I think the answer is quite simple. you know, if we become the parties of big deficit spending, the public thinks in today's world, we're taxpayers, we're going to pay for that. Right? So they're hesitant about it, I'm afraid. And even though they think the markets have failed to produce the economic crisis, they don't necessarily think big government's the answer. Okay, so we've got to take on that challenge. And we've got to recognize that actually people still are looking for a government that is responsive, that is directed towards the future, that is strategic, empowering, enabling. They have learnt a lot from the past 50 years. Yes, they've learnt in the economic crisis, markets don't always succeed. It doesn't follow from that they've now decided that government's the answer. So we've got to take on board that. The second thing is the social model in Europe. Again, it's very simple. I mean, everybody knows demography's changed. Public services have changed. Look, the lives that people live today, they make choices all over the place. And they expect things to be very responsive to them. And the companies today that aren't responsive to individual choice and individual preference, they go out of business. With the state, it's exactly the same. So if you look at things like the education system or the healthcare system today in countries like mine, they expect government to be responsive. So if we appear to be the people defending an unreformed public service, we're going to lose. Okay, simple as that. And the third issue is in respect of the cultural model. And this is really very, very difficult and very tricky. But here's what is worth what I think about it. If we end up with an issue like immigration, right, which is an issue in Europe today, it can spark a fire in the electorate immediately. And we as progressives are totally against racism, and absolutely rightly. And there is a section of those who use the immigration issue as a code for racism, no doubt about that. However, there is also a section of the population that are genuinely worried about whether there is proper order and rules in immigration, as to whether there's a proper system for deciding who comes in and who doesn't, and they're worried. Right? We have to respond to that worry. Now, if we end up responding to that worry by saying, you raise that issue, you know, you're a bad person, we're not going to win. So my view is really very simple. I mean, I still think the basic concept of what we ended up calling third way politics is correct. It's still the right way. And I don't think either the financial crisis or the issues to do with the social model or cultural model have altered that. And where the left is, and the progressive politics, is at the cutting edge of the future, strong on values, but prepared to learn the lessons of application, and understanding that the world that people live in today is a world in which, you know, they expect to operate at a far greater level of interaction and partnership. Okay? So a concept of society or government that is paternalistic and not one of partnership is not going to succeed. So this is the key thing for us to realize. And the truth is, in my experience, the right wing always win when we retreat into our comfort zone and don't keep breaking new ground. And that's what we've got to do. And the final reflection I've got is this, that the other thing we've got to be really careful of is, I always remember in 1979 when Margaret Thatcher won her first election in the UK. And there was a huge belief that the reason why the Labour government lost was because it had lost its way because it had given up on its progressive values. And, you know, I always thought this was odd. You know, why should people vote for Margaret Thatcher because they wanted a more left-wing Labour government? I could never work that one out. But the real point was this. The Labour government, in a way, had lost its way, but not for the reasons we thought. It's because the world had changed and we didn't appear to have changed with it. So I think those lessons are not time limited. I think they're always true of progressive politics. And the final thing is this. In my view, for a progressive to win, you've got to be really good and do really well, right? The Conservatives can win even in an average year. That's my experience in politics. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Helle, maybe the lesson of the last couple of years is it's better to have been out than in when the bottom really completely falls out on you. But you lead the Danish Social Democratic Party, which is improving in polls. You lead in the polls. Elections coming up next year, and I wonder whether what's been the key to that success? Has it been following on these models of trying to explain and be specific and try to argue in favor of government being on side of the people? But how have you managed to kind of move up in the polls?
First of all, Danish media is watching, so I don't take anything for granted. But of course, we're struggling every day to try and win this election because we think it is important for our country. And I think both the previous speakers said something very important for all of us. I think what's happening these days is that the right wing is actually retreating to their comfort zone. This is what they've done in the economic crisis, is that they retreated into their orthodoxies of their economic ways of thinking, which means basically big favors for big business, poor welfare for poor people. And basically, I think what they have done in this economic crisis is that they have left the center ground. And my main point today is that if the right wing in an economic crisis leave the center ground, this is where we should step in and take that center ground. That also means that when the right wing are making their effort to always listen to their interest and their sole interest, what we should be doing is grab that center ground and make new partners in areas where we haven't had partners before. What does that mean? That means for us leaving vested interest, not because we don't want to talk to public sector or trade unions, we certainly do, but we leave the vested interest and we start creating new partners. And that means try to make policies of the middle ground again. That also means that we want to make sure that people understand that we have a way of getting out of the crisis, which is not easy. I think a lot of people of the center-left have felt a little bit lost between the pain caucus of the right and the pleasure caucus of the left. There are no easy ways out. There are no easy way out of the economic crisis. There are only hard choices and difficult choices. And one of the things we have done in my country, in my political party, is one of the things I think is a useful lesson, is that we have asked our own vested interest to do more and not less. We have tried not to listen to what they normally would want, but have asked them to do what they would normally not do. One of the things we have done is to say to people, you have to work harder, you have to work more. We have said to public employees that they have to be more efficient if there are places where they're not efficient, and be accountable. We have said to young people they have to finish their education faster and more efficient than they're doing now. And I think this is the way to do it. There are no easy ways. You have to be, I'm quoting you, I think, be as friendly with business as you are with trade unions. And I think this is the new middle ground that we should, that is up for grabs now. We should take it, because one thing is sure, that the Conservatives have left it.
Thank you. Carme, if you look at what's going on in Spain in the economy, it would be familiar to our American friends here. You've gone through a period where housing prices skyrocketed, a housing bubble existed, a crash during the financial crisis. Now you have big structural unemployment. You have a particular big bulge in youth unemployment. Which what's the government's reaction to it? I know there's a new program that is being considered in the Spanish Parliament tomorrow. But how do you talk to people who, as Helle just noted, they're asking more of young people, but particularly with young people so many unemployed in Spain. What's the message to them to stick with progressive politics at this point?
It's not been easy for any of us, but it's not the first time we are facing a crisis like this. When Felipe González won the elections in Spain in 1982, I was 11 years old. When Bill Clinton in 1992 was chosen by Americans like next president, I was 21 and I was 25 when Tony Blair arrived at Downing Street. And no. I just want to say with this that, like,
we get the point.
You are, okay, let's say that, firstly, you are much more young than many of the young conservative I know in Spain and abroad. So that's first thing I want to say. Anyway, I try to say too that I remember these 3 days of historical progressive victories like if they were today. So that's, I just want to say with this how privileged I feel a day like today. But I also want to say that we need to do things like this. We need to be here together, sharing you and we. The new question and the new responses for questions that has happened already, because this is not the first time that we progressive, we are facing crisis that has been caused by conservative policies. Felipe González at the end of the 20th century, but also Bill Clinton, but also Tony Blair, they had to face with crisis caused by the conservative paradigm. And as soon as we crossed the tunnel of the crisis, then conservative happily came back to power until the next time they provoked the new crisis. And that's exactly what we are living right now. And I would like to say that we have to be here together because major changes, I would say demographic changes, economic changes, cultural changes, technological changes, and also this multidimensional crisis, they have provoked a sad result. I would say this is, during the last decades, the first time that we fear that our sons and daughters cannot expect a better life than ours. And the question is why, and the question is also why, what we should do. And I would say that we are facing this crisis that I told you that conservative powers were creating, but also I can tell you, and that's what we have to fight, our own fear. We are sometimes our own enemies. That they are very good in making people believe that we progressive in relation to economy, we are the incompetents. And when they cannot convince people on that, they try to convince people in something else, which is when we are facing crisis, all political parties, we are the same. And it's a win-win solution for them to convince people on that. But this is not true. This big international crisis we are living is the crisis of the conservative economic paradigm. Is not the crisis of the progressive economic paradigm, it's the crisis of deregulation. And I go to the example, sorry. I want to go to the conservative Ireland, which is the last economy rescued by European Union. This is the best example of deregulation of conservative economic paradigm. It's no rules at all in financial system, no rules at all in housing sector, and at the end of the day, a big crash in both, a big stroke of the crisis in both. We are all paying this. We are all paying this. But once we pay this, the responses that the progressives we are giving to this crisis of the conservative paradigm is also being differently. And I go to this point. In last May, President Zapatero had to announce the reduction of salaries of public servants. It's what President Obama had to do also last month. In UK or in Ireland, conservative government chose another solution, that is to send thousands of public servants to unemployment. So we are suffering a crisis which is not ours. We have a very reduced room to maneuver, but both of them, conservative or progressive, we are dealing with the solution of the crisis also very differently. But again, conservative are winning us in some messages, and I go to the point you were telling us. They convince us that markets will punish these countries that have high public deficit, that will punish these countries with high inflation rates, with low competitiveness, and with unbalanced foreign accounts. And this is true. But this is as true as that these are not hallmarks of progressive policies. These are not our hallmarks. We have believed and we believe. We have fight and we fight. And we got, at the end, balanced budgets and dynamic economies. Balanced budgets and growing economies. Balanced budgets are competitive economies. And also we are able to do all this with social redistribution and a greater quality of opportunity. So what we have to understand is that we need to focus today in how to re-understand, how to revise the instrument in which we have tried to have this dynamic economy and social redistribution. So it means a dynamic economy, but also our values, our classic values, like equality and solidarity. And it is a revision that we progressive have to do of welfare state in order that it works like it was when Felipe, when Bill, and when Tony Blair were on power.
Great. Thank you. Matthias, you are in a country which has come out more quickly from the financial crisis, largely built around the success of the export engine of the German economy. A lot of people think that some of the Social Democratic Party policies during the coalition government were successful in actually keeping the German economy from sinking deeper and therefore having a harder way to pull out. And yet you weren't rewarded at the polls for that. And I think there's some splintering of the center and the center left, some movement to the Green Party, et cetera. What do you see sort of going forward in terms of trying to blend modernized economic policy with a traditional appeal to the constituencies of the Social Democratic Party?
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to point out that Social Democrats in Europe, at least, lost elections before the crisis. That's true as well. So it's not the consequence out of the crisis we lost before. Only one big country today in Europe is run by a Social Democrat, that's Spain. Others are all conservative. And therefore I think we have to rethink on a couple of questions also our own politics in the 90s and our own narrative. And one of the, let's say, big issues and items for Social Democrats or Democrats is progress. Progress is, let's say, a key item for our identity, for our electorate. And progress, historically, for the labor movement was a promise. It was a promise that economic growth leads to better income, that economic growth leads to more security. Economic growth and technology progress leads to a better quality of work and a better quality of life. If you look at, let's say, the economic development today, you have to admit that even in those countries we were running, we have a decoupling of progress, economic progress, and income. We have a decoupling of economic progress and security on the labor markets and even, let's say, social transfer. And therefore, I think because progress is a key aspect of our politics, we have to rethink our model of progress, and we have to rethink how to establish a model that, let's say, that makes possible that the coupling and the decoupling of economic growth and technology progress is going to be stopped. I think that is the major question for us. And there, for this debate, we have to be honest, because one thing is very clear. There are, of course, conflicts in targets, because economic answers sometimes or often conflict with social targets. And sometimes social and economic targets conflict with environmental targets. And the difference between us and the conservatives is, to my mind, that we have to give good answers on this. We have to manage the conflict, because there is a conflict, as we all know. And looking at Europe today, I think we have to start, let's say, a project that I would call New Progress, that's trying to look at these kind of conflicts and trying to make clear, yes, it's possible to make to bring economic growth, economic growth, and security together. But that also means looking at, let's say, political instruments. Give you just one sentence on that. I think we have to rethink the relation of state and market. We have to rethink that. If you look at the development on the financial sector, we need for the next years more regulation. That's very clear. And every government is giving this. The American government and others are going in that direction. So we have to, let's say, make clear we need this kind of, let's say, a new balance between state and market. Let me give a second example for this. If we want to face the challenge of climate change and the environmental question, and we want to reduce CO2 emissions by 80 to 95% in 2050, this means a third industrial revolution, because this will mean at the end we have to invent an industrial-based economy that is able to be industrial economy without CO2 emissions. And the question is, does the market do this, or don't we need, let's say, incentives, tax incentives? Don't we need, let's say, economic instruments like emission trading? Don't we need standards that are clearly defined to bring up the technology? Yes. Our answer must be yes. A conservative answer is no. But that is clear. But that also means we have to rethink what I said, let's say, market and state, and what are, let's say, the options and what are the jobs of these two instruments. So I would like to, and we are starting this in the Social Democratic Party for in the next year. We are trying to think what is a new progress for, and what are the instruments for new progress? Because one thing is very important. When we go to the electorate, we have to fulfill what we have said, and therefore I think we have to rethink one or the other question and the one or the other instrument that was in our programs in the last years.
Tony, I'd maybe get you to react to that a little bit. I think that you've been, if you look at the economies on both sides of the Atlantic, you've seen essentially the hollowing out of middle-skill, middle-wage jobs. That's been the result of technology, of globalization, of more competition worldwide, and yet you see the job growth as being at both ends in the UK and the US in the financial sector, and job growth at the bottom of the income spectrum. What do we do to address what Matthias is talking about, which is to reconnect the linkage between the stewardship of the economy to trying to support the middle class, and particularly with middle-skilled jobs?
We got a bunch more. Thanks. I just think we've got to be, I mean, I agree actually with a lot of what Matthias has just said, but I just think we've got to be always on the guard, and maybe I'm too insistent on this, about what's changed about the world and what hasn't. You know, you know, when I was at university, probably about the time you were born, actually. But you know, when I was in a rock band, he was playing the saxophone, and life was good back then. It was good. But but I also we had these as yours do at university. We had these far left groups, and there was one Trotskyist group. Most of whose members ended up as investment bankers in later life, but there was one of these guys who is an old friend of mine who never changed. Right, when this financial crisis came out, he said to me, "I told you capitalism had failed," and I just think, you know, we've got to analyze very carefully what has happened here, because you see, I would say that the answer to the issues to do with people's insecurity today is very much about what the role of government should be, right? Not whether there is a role for government, because I agree with that, and that is, look, we will always divide from the right, who want a minimalist state and who basically believe that government is a kind of necessary evil, but that's about it. Okay. However, what sort of state and what does the state do? That is a really big question that we've got to get right. And we've got to be careful that we don't go back and say, well, okay, as a result of this financial crisis, really, you know, what we used to say 20 years ago was right all along. You know, we've got to be really careful of that. So my view would be you go heavily into things like education, right, which is still the single most important thing for us, and a modern view of how we educate our people. In particular, I think for all countries, and certainly in our part of the world, the challenge of higher education is enormous. We look at how we encourage the development of new industrial sectors. You know, there's a huge amount that can be done, actually. It's being done around green technology, for example. We should encourage all that. But I would say that the third way answer, if I can put it like this, to climate change is to create a framework of incentives, but not for government to end up thinking, right, we know the technologies of the future, and now we're going to decide which they are. Now, we probably agree on, right. So I think this is the area where we need to focus on and develop the right thinking about. Because, look, the difference between ourselves and the right will always be the same. In the end, the right wing will always look after the privileged few at the top and not care about the rest. And they'll always be in a situation where basically they're letting people drift and we're there to help them. But how we do that is the critical question today. And just one thing also on what is happening in Spain, I think is both very interesting, and I actually think the Prime Minister is showing a lot of courage in what he's doing. But I think, you know, in what he's doing, in a sense, is to offer something will way through this financial crisis, where we're not trying to deny that we're going to have to make big changes as a result of this, but we're making changes that try and help steer our country through it in the right way. So I think it's the policy focus that we need to get, and that's based around a concept of government that's enabling. And this is, you know, I remember with President Clinton, obviously, the whole reinventing government issue. I still think that's with us, even today.
I would note at the Center for American Progress, we actually stole one of Tony's top guys who's helping us actually do work in what we call doing what works, which is to try to make government more productive, more efficient, and deliver the goods. So we thank you for that, Mr. Blair. Mr. President, you might want to just react to that, but I also wanted to note that you had to govern in a period in which there was a large structural deficit. There were major calls for retrenchment. You had to reduce the federal workforce as President Obama has just called for, at least a freeze on that. And you had to protect certain investments. And in that context, how do you pick and choose between what you want to do to create growth and what you want to do in order to ensure that there's greater equitable distribution of that growth in the society? Are they at odds or do they work together?
I want to answer. Is this on?
Yeah.
I'll answer that, but I want to try to follow up on what Matthias and Tony said, what you've all said. I did 133 events for my party in the last election. We got the living hell beat out of us. But voters, and I explain why, but people make perfectly rational decisions based on what they know and the way they understand the world and the way it's coming at them. And you just forget about politics. Think about every time in your life you felt disoriented and insecure and angry and uncertain emotionally. You want to go home. You want to go back to home base, which is why the immigration issues became so explosive and all these other things. It always gives the right an advantage if they can have a narrative that says, I look like you, I think like you, I talk like you, come home. Never mind the details. Why do I say that? I was thinking, listening to all my counterparts up here talk, I'm proud to just be sitting here. These people are really smart, and they have just explained what they think and why. But very often when we get before a television camera or in a political situation, we think some rhetorical answer is more important than cutting the bull and putting, as we used to say in the farming area where I grew up, putting the corn where the hogs can get at it. I say that because I used to go around to places which were tough for us and tell people, I said, you may not want to hear this, but I think the president and the leaders of Congress have done a much better job than you do. Would you please let me tell you why? And invariably people would come up to me and say, dear God, why didn't I know that? You have to understand, just because our 10-year-old children and grandchildren can get on the internet and find out things in 30 seconds, the aged among us had to go to university to learn, does not mean that there is some framework which allows the relevant things to stick and the ephemeral things to float away. So if you listen to Tony, even now, it's been a long time since he ran for office, he's still out there talking about empowerment. He's using words that people know what he means when he uses them. I believe very strongly that we lost way more seats than we needed to by not having a narrative and also not explaining in ways people could understand why these decisions made. I'll just give you one on the fiscal issue. And I'll give you a German example too. And maybe it will help to answer John's question. We ended, I thought, when I left office, the idea that the Democrats were fiscally irresponsible. We had 4 surpluses, we paid down the debt. Okay, when the Republicans won the Congress and the White House for the first time in a long time, the first thing they did was to repeal the central procedural rule which gave us those surpluses. It's called the pay-as-you-go rule. Basically means if you're going to do something new, you have to do it out of revenue growth, a tax increase, or a spending cut. They got rid of it, and we borrowed the money from China and the UK and Saudi Arabia and Japan to fight 2 wars, give the seniors a drug benefit, and do a wonderful program on HCV malaria. Now, people kind of got that. But then they didn't know what we were doing with this stimulus thing because the deficit was already $1.2 trillion when President Obama took office. You have to explain, it's $1.2 trillion because nobody can pay taxes. And the president did the right thing. He appointed this bipartisan deficit reduction commission. It did the right thing, never mind the details. On timing, they say, we should do this, but we should begin in the beginning of 2012. We have to have growth, then we balance the budget. We never satisfactorily explained to the American people the difference between a stimulus in the short run to shore up demand and stop the collapse and then begin to build back, and a commitment to fiscal responsibility. It was our failure, our collective failure, but that goes just to what Tony was saying. One other thing, here's an interesting thing. 2 months before the election, there was an international survey which came out that said the U.S. had recovered 70% of its lost GDP from the trough. Germany had recovered 60%. But Germany's unemployment rate was 2 points lower than ours. One reason is, instead of just paying into an unemployment trust fund, which is the way our system works, they pay into a fund which enables the government to supplement the salaries of people while they're still working. So it's much cheaper to keep people working even at lower hours by having the government give a little bit of money to their salaries. Every progressive in the world should have been saying, my God, why don't we do that here? Now, in the stimulus, the Obama administration actually gave money to states to experiment with the German system, but we kept it a secret from the voters. Normally not a good idea. The only thing I'm trying to say is, so let's go back to what John said. How do you make the trade-offs? There is no general rule. You have to know in your gut when a cut is going to severely harm innocent people, and nearly everybody of good conscience would not do that. You also have to know in your gut when you're just preserving the comfort zone of the status quo, and you have to be willing to let it go in order to save enough money to build that clean energy future, to restore a manufacturing base, to get America or the EU or anybody else back in the future business. We basically got caught in the government business in America on Election Day instead of in the future business. And it is devastating for America, but also for you. I think that's a very useful model. But because we want to build a future we can share, you have to know what you won't do. For example, I vetoed 2 versions of the welfare reform bill that I had run for president to support because the Republicans thought we should ban the national guarantee of nutrition and health care for poor children. I said I won't do that. But I will give states the right to set the reimbursement because they have de facto had it since '73. So we did it. We reduced welfare rolls 60%. And in the first recession of the last decade, people who moved from welfare to work were actually slightly less likely to lose their jobs than the populace as a whole. You have to know. And whatever the answer is for you, the 5 of us, we might give different answers. You've got to tell people. Sometimes it doesn't matter at the margin. They have to know you are not defending the enterprise of government itself, that you're in it for the people, and that you're in the change business. Because, and this last thing I'll say, I'm leaving at 6 in the morning to go down and co-chair the interim Haiti Reconstruction Commission. A lot of your countries have given us money, and I thank you for that. The problem in every poor country, Tony has a whole branch of his foundation that works on this. The problem in all these poor countries is they have no systems. All the things that got every one of you in these chairs today, they don't have them. The problem in every developed country is all the systems that got us in these chairs today need constant improvement. So our business has to be the reform business. And I think now, and we have to do it with a sense of security. That's my advice, John. And get the kind. I would have a Danish version, a Spanish version, a British version, a German version of this is how we're going to get back in the future business. Germany is doing pretty well because they have the highest GDP in Europe or in any of the OECD countries, including Japan, tied to exports, and they have penetrated the German and the other Asian markets. And because they have a clever employment, not unemployment system. And that's why your chancellor, to the rest of us outside, can beat up on you and see she's being fiscally conservative, and she doesn't look like a harridan because the numbers look good to us from the outside because of stuff you've done for years and years.
And to the question, though, of do you have to give up equity in order to power?
You can't because look at America. That's the problem in this country. If you give up equity, then at some point you shrivel. Before the financial crisis in America, we only had 2.5 million new jobs in 7 years and 8 months. 1/10 as many as in the previous 8 years. Why? All of the growth was in housing, consumer spending, which are inherently limited, and finance, which is inherently unequal. Germany leapfrogged Japan and the U.S. to become the #1 country in the manufacture and deployment of solar energy. Spain now has the largest solar thermal capacity in the world. Spain got killed by, like Arizona. Spain was Arizona and Nevada. It was a pure real estate collapse. That everybody thought the next 5 years would be like the last 20. The Germans, Deutsche Bank, I'm not talking about Greenpeace, Deutsche Bank did a study that said that even accounting for the drag of the solar subsidies, the German economy had netted 300,000 jobs in a country where the sun shines on average as much as it does in London.
960 hours. 960 hours.
Yeah.
Maybe may I ask the whole panel, does equity power growth, or does it restrain it?
Thank you. Yeah, we are thinking all the time about how we can deal with local instruments in a global economy, and also how we can keep on or maintain the results of the welfare state of the 80s in the new and so changing world of today. And I go to some numbers of the welfare of the 80s. I really think welfare in the 80s, it did a good job. During the 80s, inequalities were increasing in general, but particularly they were increasing in countries with conservative governments. And I go to the numbers. In countries with progressive government, on the contrary, and I go to the Spain run by Felipe González, only between 1980 and 1990, the proportion of total income corresponding to the poorest decile of the population rose only in 10 years by 17.9%. And in these 10 years, the richest decile fell 5.4%. We have never seen those numbers again. But we really think that today, the conception of welfare state have to change a lot. We are trying to be brave in changes. Germany made some changes 10 years ago. That's why they have better results today. Spain is not in this situation. We are doing them today. And we are thinking, how can we deal with a very different society? The most important changes, I would say, in the labor market, and I also would like to give some numbers. Substantial reduction of the active life. We are talking about even 45 years of active life to 30 years, 30 current years. An increase of non-working years from 10 to 20 years. And also something that was a right, a very important right, the massive incorporation of women to labor market, but it has had the result of some needs in our family structure that we have to cover. We also have a new necessity, which is to deal with these new numbers of the state, these financial big problems we are having. And also we have to think about some problems of design of welfare state. I would say, for instance, in Spain, 48 of our money, public money invested, 48 of them, it's not being redistributive. So we really have to focus in a new welfare state, more redistributed, and we have to forget more to granting universal rights for everyone. So we have to go to their numbers, to the numbers of the 80s and 90s of welfare state. We have to focus in this new society with these young people that needs more education in a more informated, but not with more knowledgement people, which is one of our problems. And also we need to reinforce democracy. I think we have a big problem with disaffection for democracy, not only of young people, but more than young people. So I think we have to focus on what they did and the good job the welfare state did in the 80s and 90s, and how we can do the same with these new changes in society, with these new models of family, structures of family we have, and also with these young people that has many information, what doesn't mean exactly knowledgement.
Helle, we live in with a happy delusion in the United States that young people here are particularly progressive in their orientation. They believe in more social inclusion. They're more communitarian oriented. They believe in service. The ability to deal with others is I think a hallmark of young people. How does that feel in Denmark?
Well,
and particularly picking up on what Carme said, what's your answer to young people who are looking for a future?
Well, my basic answer is this, that the Conservatives, as I was saying, is seeing the economic crisis as a great opportunity to turn back time. And that means they will cut everything that is connected to the state, to the welfare state, to everything that we like. And what I'm saying is I totally agree with what's been said, that we must never shy away from making cuts, from taking hard choices, from making big priorities, from reforming our welfare state, from changing what we made. But there are certain things that we need to invest in. And one of those things, and that's to answer your question, one of those things are, of course, our young people. I think it is crazy when the right-wing government in certain countries, the UK right now, other countries, are making severe cuts on young people's education. I'd like to bring just one example. Before all this crisis, a small country like Denmark, a really small country, lost 200,000 jobs every year. The good news was that we got 200 new jobs every year. And the reason why that is possible is because we had put a lot of money, I mean, Paul, who's sitting here, put a lot of money and investment in education and training. And that is why I think there's one area where we should always be known, and that is that we want to focus on young people, make sure they get a degree, make sure they're ready to work, not shy away from also demanding high things of them, demanding that they finish their education, that they get started with their working life, but we must make sure that we keep investing in our young people. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that the right is doing across Europe and perhaps other places as well is to cut in terms of investing in young people.
Tony, you want to react to the question of whether, and I'll ask Matthias to react to the question of whether focusing on human capital, more equity, more investment in particularly in young people is a better growth model than what the Conservatives are offering?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Look, if progressives stop being about greater equity, opportunity for all people, not simply a few, then we stop being progressive. But I just want to make this point because I think the issue for us today and the challenge, it's really important to determine the question here. The issue is not, do we carry on believing in equity, right? Because obviously we do. That's not the challenge. The challenge is, how do you translate that into policies that address the world as it is and the future, not the world as we might like it to be, right? And let me just give two examples in that. We have to be the education reformers, not just the investors in education, right? We cannot allow, let me be absolutely brutal about it, we cannot allow education policy simply to be decided by the teachers' union, right? It has to be decided according to the needs of the pupils and the students, and there is no greater injustice than kids going to schools where there are poor standards and they don't get the education they need. Now, we've got to be the people not simply talking about the investment in it, but also the reform. And the second area is this, which is one that, you know, I learned a lot actually from listening and watching President Clinton on this. There is a new paradigm in social policy today. It's what I call the pro-gay rights and tough on law and order position, right? In other words, as progressives, what we're about is developing the human capital of our society to its fullest extent and giving everyone opportunity. Crime is a real problem for our people, right? Every time someone is in fear, and it's the poor who are in most fear, that is a social injustice we have to address. On the other hand, that old social conservatism that was reactionary in terms of race and gender and sexuality, that is something that, for the same reason, because it's unjust, we are against such prejudice. So a society of rules but without prejudice is what we're about. So my point is this. Yes, we always have to be the party that believes in equity and in equity powering growth. But our challenge today is to make sure that we have the policies set in the future that allow us to be the parties not merely of great values, but also of the policies that translate those values into practice in the world in which we live today. And it's when we're at the cutting edge of the future, we win.
I'd add gender equity to the powering human
Of course,
capital
absolutely.
point too, and particularly, I know that's happened in Northern Europe and the U.S. with more women in the workforce. Matthias?
Yeah, I'd like to react on what has said by Tony Blair before. And I'd like to answer with the following little historical example. The French socialists lost elections in the 80s. And after having lost this election, they made a paper, as social democrats always do, doing papers. And the first sentence of this paper was, when we got into power, we were trying to change society. Now we have to admit society has changed us. Why I'm going to say that? Because sometimes, and that is true, let's say, for the social democrats in Germany, we have also lost a little bit of credibility during our running the country. Because we, and that has something to do with progress, some of the expectations that were linked with us didn't come. And I'll give you one example. Everyone is looking at this wonderful labor improvement and employment improvement in Germany. Now I give you the numbers. Okay, indeed, we have 40 million people who have a job now. This is the highest rate we ever had in history. But also true is more than 10 million people have bad jobs. That's about 30%. These are jobs with small incomes and so on. And now people are asking us, so is the price for a job bad income? And that's a decent question. And we as social democrats have to answer this. Because I could show you that, of course, some of the, let's say, flexibilities in the labor market is not needed. I'll give you one answer. We have an instrument of time work, so in certain companies, so you work on time. Only 7% of those people who worked in these kind of companies get a decent job. So the question is that a proper instrument to bring people into jobs? And so I would say my answer is, as you were talking about law and order, of course law and order is, as you said, 1997 or whensoever, this is a social democratic issue, I remember that. But law and order on the labor market is also a social democratic issue. And we should never forget about this, because this is very important for people, because they want to be flexible, but they also want to have a clear, let's say, possibility of planning their biography. I'll give you a second example from Germany. If you look at younger people today, well-educated, the best educated generation after the war in Germany that we ever had, most of them, when they come from university or from other education form, they now go into, let's say, Zeitarbeit, time work. So they get an agreement for 1 or 2 years, and you can see what that means. They don't know, do I stay in this country, in this town where I'm living now, or do I have to move? Do I meet with a girl I met last night, because does this investment take place? Maybe I have to leave this town tomorrow. Do I get children? Do I build a? Yeah, that is true. So I'm very much for flexibility, but we have to also look at one thing. What is the cost? What's the price for a personal for a person and for the society if we create this kind of flexibility? That's also a very, very, very important question for Social Democrats. And the last thing, coming back to what has been said on the economy. There, exactly, we have to do very hard, there are hard choices. Because true is, if we want to deal with the consequences of the financial crisis, and we want to do the investments into the future, like education and so on, we have to admit one thing. The public sector is underfinanced. That is the truth. And that will lead us to, let's say, certain decisions on taxation and other questions. And as we all know, these are not simple questions if you have to, let's say, run a country or if you want to win elections. But that is also one of the things we have to think. Because the answer can't be, that's very important. The answer can't be, we do the same politics as we did for the financial crisis. I think also Social Democrats have to rethink what is the answer because of the financial crisis for, let's say, different sectors of our politics, and what is the framework. And therefore, I'm coming back, last sentence, to what I said with the progress. Progress is, let's say, a very, very important, let's say, aura of progressive, of course, and Social Democrats. But then we have to make clear how to create this. And that is very important. What are the instruments for this? Values are fine. I love values. But values are not the answer to social, economic, and other questions. So therefore, you need instruments, and we have to rethink a couple of instruments to let's say, to bring those value into power.
Well, this has set up a wonderful debate, which is what we intended and what we will do over dinner and what we will do tomorrow. But unfortunately, we could go on all evening. We didn't even get to the global security challenges, for which I apologize, but we'll talk about that as well. But please join me in thanking just really a remarkable panel. And if I could, we're about to move to a reception, but if I could ask you to remain seated for just a moment while our panelists retire, and then we'll move on to the reception. Thank you again.